Well, I just ran into the couple. The guy refused to.
It's time for the drill. See how you all do. Good evening.
Good evening.
I don't even have to do that a second time. Welcome to the penultimate program in the 2024 lecture series on the second day of spring. We threw this off a little bit there. 70-degree weather last week, snow this week, now that it's officially spring. So thank you all again for coming out tonight. Jeanne and Judi, two strong women of local note, always bring in a good crowd. So we're happy to see you all tonight and have Jeanne and Judi with us. As you all know, the library partners with the Great Stone Viaduct Society every year to bring these programs to you on Wednesday nights in February and March. We hope to see you all next week for the final program with another repeat lecturer from last year, Taylor Abbott. He'll be presenting, get up here, A River Runs Through It, Early Exploration of the Ohio River. So it should be a nice program to end on. We hope to see you all back next year as well as next week. So please come in 2024, February and March, Wednesdays, 6 o'clock. These programs will last you 3 years. If you're a regular, you know this, have been live streamed on both Facebook and YouTube. I know all of our virtual watchers there. So if you've missed any, you can always go back. You can go to our website or to Facebook or to our YouTube channel to watch those online. And if you can't make any future programs, can't make it next week, or any of the upcoming programs in 2024, which we're already planning, sort of, and beyond, you can always watch those online. So just be aware that if you can't make them, you can still watch them. And we look forward to having you here and online. A few other quick announcements. How many people are new to the library here? Okay. For those who are new, there'll be bathrooms if you need to use them. If you go out the doors, take a left and a left. The men's is on the left. That's 3 lefts for the men, 2 lefts, and a right for the women. And then finally, out of respect for our speakers tonight, we've got to silence our cell phones, please. I don't have any rotten tomatoes. I always forget to bring them, but we will start using them in the future for people who do not silence their cell phones. All right, for tonight's program, 8 women of note. Those of you who have been attending regularly this series know that I tried to throw in a couple of plays on words, but I tried to pen some puns for this one, but none of my ideas were worth noting. So I'll just go ahead and concede to literary defeat and just introduce our guests tonight. Judi Hendrickson and Jeanne Finstein are local history researchers who enjoy discovering and sharing interesting pieces of the past, particularly with New England history, much like they're going to do tonight. They are the authors of a book on local history, Walking Pleasant Valley, and are both long-term members of the historic preservation organization Friends of Wheeling. Please welcome Jeanne Finstein and Judi Hendrickson and the 8 women of note they will be portraying.
She didn't mention that we just do this because we like to play dress up. That's the real reason. Good evening. My name is Elizabeth Zane, but my friends and family call me Betsy. And today, most people actually call me Betty Zane. I'm proud to be the first one in this talk about a few of the well-known women in Wheeling's history. Of course, you already know a bit about me and my family, but let me review a bit. I was born in 1765 to William and Elizabeth Zane. I was the only daughter in a family that had 5 sons. My family was living in Moorfield, Virginia, in what is now called the Eastern Panhandle of West Virginia, when Father and all 5 of my older brothers were captured by Indians and held for ransom. Eventually, they were taken all the way to Detroit. After 2 years in captivity, all but the youngest boy, Isaac, were ransomed and returned home to the South Branch of the Potomac. Isaac was only 9 years old when he was kidnapped. He was adopted by his Indian family, and he lived with them and eventually his Indian wife for most of the rest of his life. I was born after father and my brothers returned from captivity. And I was just a toddler, about 3 years old, when 3 of my older brothers, Ebenezer, Silas, and Jonathan, first came to this valley and decided to settle here, claiming the land by marking the trees with tomahawks, and then later bringing their families and planting crops. After my mother died, my father joined my older brothers in Wheeling, and I was sent to live with an aunt in Philadelphia to become a proper lady. In 1777, when I was still in Philadelphia, the Native Americans made their first major attack on the Wheeling settlement. It was during the fighting that Sam McCulloch made his famous leap down Wheeling Hill as he was coming to help defend Fort Henry. Of course, my family knew Sam because his sister had married my oldest brother, Ebenezer Zane. Well, after my aunt died, I also came to Wheeling. Life was a lot harder here than it was in Philadelphia. We were very busy, we women. We had to cook, wash, sew, weave, and do all the other household tasks without the niceties and supplies that the ladies in the East had at hand. The men usually hunted and fished, and we women grew vegetables and tended the livestock and the poultry and did other farm work as well. All while living with the daily reality that there was a potential Indian attack. Fortunately, we had Fort Henry where we could stay in relative safety. The fort was on a hillside overlooking the Ohio River, standing at what is now about the corner of 11th and Main Streets in Wheeling. Most of us felt that we were safe to go there in case of an attack. However, the fort had been built in 1774 and wasn't in the best of shape by the time I got to Wheeling 7 years later. So they decided to store the gunpowder for the settlement, not in the fort, but in the blockhouse across the way, about 50 yards away, that was owned by my brother Ebenezer. So that brings me to the event for which I am most remembered. September 10th, 1782, some scouts spotted a force of approximately 260 Indians, British Rangers, just a couple of hours away from Wheeling. We took these reports seriously, and so we fled to the fort for protection. Now keep in mind there were only about 20 men of fighting age in the fort, along with about twice as many women and children. So we were severely outnumbered. Even so, we refused to surrender. While the men were manning the guns, we women molded bullets and loaded rifles and hoped and prayed that the attack would soon be over. Around noon on the second day, we were still holding on, but we were running low on gunpowder. And then, of course, we remembered where it was. Now, they say that 3 men volunteered to go get the gunpowder, but we were afraid to lose any of the men because they were the best shots in the group. And so I volunteered. I ran from the fort about 50 yards to the blockhouse. During this time, not a shot was fired at me. I think the attackers were kind of amazed and dumbfounded at what this woman was doing running across the field. By the time I got to the blockhouse and loaded the gunpowder in my apron and made my way back, they figured out what was going on. And they did shoot at me, but miraculously, nothing hit me. The gunpowder arrived with me, and the fort was saved. Well, after the battle, our lives settled down a bit once more. There were no more attacks, and life returned to relative normal. After that, it's true, I had a daughter out of wedlock. The father was Van Swearinger. My family stood by me, though, and took Van to court, where he was ordered to deed some of his property to me so our daughter Miriam would not become a burden on the county. Later, I married Ephraim McLaughlin. We had 4 more daughters. And after his death, I married Jacob Clark, and we had 2 more children, a son, Ebenezer Clark, and a daughter, Catherine Clark. Our family moved to Ohio, and that's where we spent the rest of our lives. I died at the age of 58 and was buried near my brother Ebenezer in what is now called the Walnut Grove Pioneer Cemetery in Martins Ferry, Ohio. But even though I'm gone, my famous dash lives on. So I'll leave you now so you can hear about another well-known woman from about the same time period, and that would be Lydia Shepherd.
Thank you, Betty. Good afternoon, good evening.
Good evening.
I'm Lydia Bob Shepherd. Welcome to my home. I didn't know all of you were coming to dinner, which I'm having this evening, so I'm going to have to make other arrangements. I'm Lydia Bob Shepherd, as Betty said. I was born February 26, 1766 in Berkeley County, and I spent my childhood on the Virginia frontier. And that is where my father, John Boggs, served as a militia captain. Our family settled near Wheeling in 1774, where we experienced the dangers of the Indian Wars and the siege of Fort Henry. I met Moses Shepherd in 1782, and we were married in 1800. Our business success, growing political influence, and enormous land holdings gave us great wealth. It was symbolized by Shepherd Hall, and it was a stone mansion, and we built it in the reason to host our very elite friends. My husband and I were prolific socialites and played host to several prominent guests during our lifetimes. We often visited Washington, D.C., and soon became friends with many, many politicians such as Henry Clay, James Polk, and Andrew Jackson. While some of these politicians, especially Henry Clay, passed through Wheeling, they would often stay at Monument Place. Once, I hosted an elegant dinner party, somewhat like I'm doing this evening, and that was for the Marquis de Lafayette, who was traveling through Wheeling. He actually had an accident, lost all his clothes to a boat accident, but he came with clothes on. Now, construction of the National Road was one of the first federal infrastructure projects in the fledgling United States. As the responsible party to the U.S. government commissioned Moses to construct both the Elm Grove and Philadelphia bridges, and the Philadelphia Bridge no longer exists. I believe it's an S bridge. And both of those were put on the new National Road. During the planning of the National Road in the 1800s, there were discussions as to whether the road should go more north to where they would cross the river in Wellsburg, or further south to where Wheeling is. And because the decision was made, now people say the decision was made sometimes because they said I had an affair with Henry Clay. Well, I didn't. Well, I didn't. But anyway, it was determined that by the government that Wheeling was the most advantageous route for the road to come this way. But Moses did get the road shifted slightly, extending it about 200 yards closer to our home so that it would pass right in front. But he paid for that. He paid for that personally. Well, Moses was the person who was commissioned to build the National Road Bridge. He certainly wasn't the one who built it. He didn't do physical labor. Well, Moses paid a gentleman by the name of Charles Wallace $1,500 to build the bridge. And since we had slaves, they also helped to build the bridge. Well, I must go now. because I apparently have to have our helpers set more of our table for you. I'm going to tell you the rest of the story. Monument Place gets its nickname due to Lydia Shepherd Kruger erecting a statue honoring Henry Clay for building the National Road to the area, and that monument no longer stands. After Moses died in 1832 during the cholera epidemic, Lydia married Daniel Kruger, Kruger, 14 years a United States congressman, and after coming to Wheeling, he continued being an attorney. Daniel Kruger died very suddenly of apoplexy, which is a stroke, on July 12, 1843, at the age of 62, during a bank meeting in Wheeling. After he died, Lydia continued to live in Shepherd Hall, managing that huge, extensive plantation and a large business interest that they had. Lydia, in her older years, was a lonely, eccentric woman. Her eccentricity had been fostered by the hardships and the solitude of pioneer life. In 1849, when she was 83 years old, she caused a heated controversy when she swore out an affidavit discrediting Betty Zane as the heroine of the gunpowder exploit during the 1782 siege of Fort Henry, 67 years after the event, in which she was one of the last surviving eyewitnesses. That's why Lydia didn't like Betty Zane. Plus, they were after the same man. If you look at their pictures, they were not hookers. Neither one of them. Now, Lydia Bob Shepherd Kruger died September 26th at the age of 101 at Shepherd Hall. Long life. It said in her obituary this: her longevity was because she ate slowly and never drank her tea or coffee hot. It took her 1/2 hour to drink a cup of tea. As the neighborhood of Elm Grove grew and Wheeling developed the street that passes directly in front of Shepherd Hall, Monument Place, this was given the name Kruger Street, but Kruger was misspelled. It's spelled Kruger, and the misspelled version of the surname was never corrected, and the street remains the same, of Kruger Street to the present day. Thank you.
Hello, my name is India Hornbrook Kelly. I'm here to share a bit about Wheeling's history during the Civil War. Although I only had an indirect involvement in the events during the war, my family was certainly an illustration of the divided loyalties here in the state. Let me start at the beginning. I was born in 1840, the daughter of Jacob and Anna Killen Hornbrook. Father was born in England, mother was born in Ireland. Typical of the time, they were immigrants. As a young man, father, along with his brothers, worked on flatboats, selling and buying produce, owning retail stores, and being involved in steamboats and banking. They became quite successful. Perhaps you know the country estate of my uncle. My uncle Thomas Hornbrook and his wife Tryphena owned an estate that is now known as Wheeling Park. When the Civil War began, my Uncle Thomas was a surveyor of customs at the Port of Wheeling. His office was in the Custom House, now known as West Virginia Independence Hall. He was a very strong supporter of the Union. He actually refused to turn property over to the Confederate supporting governor of Virginia at the time. And he allowed the Union to store guns and gunpowder in the basement of that building. Meanwhile, my father was a delegate to the first Wheeling Convention. This urged the western counties of the state to form a new state loyal to the Union. He also helped with recruiting efforts and came to be known as the soldier's friend. He and I even traveled around the countryside to be present when the soldiers were paid. You see, many feared that they would not make it home, and they worried about their families and how they would survive without the breadwinner. And so when they were paid, they asked us to bring their pay back to Wheeling. I well remember the Christmas of 1863. That was just a few months after West Virginia became an official state. The first West Virginia infantry was in Petersburg, in what is now known as the Eastern Panhandle of West Virginia. Father and I took the men all kinds of delicacies that their friends and neighbors had prepared for them. My younger brother was named Henry Hornberg. He was just 18 when the war broke out, and he enlisted in Company C of the 1st Virginia Infantry in April of 1861. Now keep in mind, at that time, we thought the war would be over in 3 months. And so I think a lot of the young men thought this was going to be an adventure. Little did they know what it would turn out to be. The commander of the 1st West Virginia was Benjamin Franklin Kelly, who was also a Wheeling man. The soldiers left Wheeling in late May of 1861 and went to the middle of the state to protect the B&O Railroad from attack by the Confederates. Their first engagement was in the small town of Philippi. It wasn't a major battle, but it was actually the first land battle of the Civil War. Colonel Kelly was severely wounded, and my brother Henry stood sentry, unrelieved, for 48 hours, where Kelly lay. Fortunately, Dr. Joseph Thoburn was the surgeon for the unit and took good care of Colonel Kelly. Kelly did survive and went on to become a general in the Civil War. After the war, I married General Kelly's son. His name was John Goshorn Kelly. And you may recognize that middle name. This is where things get complicated. Goshorn. You see, my husband's mother was Isabella Goshorn. Her father was John Goshorn, her brother was William Goshorn. And you may know their name because they are the ones who owned the slave Lucy Bagby. Lucy escaped right before the war began and had made her way to Cleveland. And the father and son Goshorns went to Cleveland to claim her as their property and brought her back to Wheeling. And we think she may have been the last fugitive slave that was returned to the South under the fugitive slave law. Back to my brother. He did survive his 3-month service, and then he re-enlisted in the 3-year service. He was made a 2nd lieutenant and was an aide-de-camp and quartermaster with Colonel Joseph Thoburn, the same doctor who helped save General Kelly. Sadly, Dr. Thoburn was killed in action late in the war. But Henry survived the war and later became vice president of the Top Mill. You might recognize that name too. It later became part of Wheeling Steel. After Henry's first wife died, he married Alice Craycraft. And here's another twist in the story. You see, Alice, my sister-in-law, had a brother, George Craycraft, who was a Confederate soldier in the Civil War. George had actually been banished from the town of Philadelphia because of his Confederate leanings. But after the war, he returned to Wheeling and became one of Wheeling's most well-known doctors. And so you see, the war years were very confusing for many of us, with friends and neighbors and even family members on both sides of the conflict. Well, I'm glad that's all behind us now, and we're able to spend our lives in peace. Good evening. My name is Ellie Poole. It's kind of strange to be back here in the north. I can't stay long. I'm always afraid there's going to be someone chasing after me. That's how I left in the fall of 1861. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back a bit. I was born in 1838 to Joseph and Sarah Poole. My family lived at 82 Clay Street. You know it as 18th Street now, in Wheeling. Father was a molder, and I was a teacher at the 4th Ward School, which was not far from where we lived. Well, as you know, by 1860, there was a lot of conversation about whether or not the western counties, or any of the counties in Virginia, should stay in the Union or not. Most people in Wheeling favored the Union. But my family, we chose Virginia. There was no way we would turn our backs on our home state. On May 23rd of 1861, many of the men in Wheeling voted for the Ordinance of Secession for Virginia to secede from the Union, and they were considered traitors. My brother Jerome was one of those. Now, Jerome worked in a coffee shop where the delegates to the Wheeling Convention sometimes had refreshments. And so we learned a lot about what was going on behind the scenes. And this is where my troubles began. You see, they say that I wrote articles for the Richmond Inquirer and Baltimore Exchange favoring the South. They said I had incriminating papers in my guitar case. And I traveled back and forth to Richmond a good bit. I'm not going to say what I was doing. Well, on October 6th of 1861, I was arrested in Wheeling by the local marshal, Edward M. Norton. I was charged with espionage. Well, I told him I just wasn't well. Female problems, just let me stay in my own home under house arrest. And he did, he let me. Well, that night, I got out. Some people said that I got out through the basement. Some people said I tied some sheets together and climbed out of the second floor. Some people said that the key to the door had been left for me and I just used it. But I'm not going to tell you how I got out because I might need to do that again. But I did. And I made my way to the river and got into a small boat and floated down to New Martinsville. And from there, I got on a steamboat that was headed for Cincinnati. From Cincinnati, I traveled on to Louisville. And then I was discovered that I was being pursued. I suppose I should have been flattered, for you see, my pursuer was a man by the name of Delos Thurman Bly. He later became a very famous detective, and he was known as Yankee Bly. Well, I just couldn't put him off. I thought I would get on another train and head for Indiana. He got on the same train and followed me and arrested me. That was on November 7th of 1861, just over a month from when I left Wheeling. Well, Bly took me to Louisville and brought me before General William Tecumseh Sherman. I had about $7,500 in Confederate money on me, so I suppose I did look a little bit suspicious. Well, Bly took me to Washington, D.C., and I was placed under house arrest with a woman by the name of Rose Greenhow. Her house was called the Greenhow Prison, but actually it was just a regular house, and we were confined to the second floor, but we had 2 parlors and a warm fire and a piano, and it wasn't all that bad. You may have heard of her. Her nickname was Wild Rose. She was a widow and was a member of the highest society in Washington, D.C., so she kind of looked down on those of us from, poorer roots. They say that she passed secret messages to Confederate General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard. Don't you love that name? And President Jefferson Davis actually credited her with the Confederate win at First Bull Run. Well, in addition to Mrs. Greenhow and her daughter, who was 8 years old, little Rose, there were several other ladies who were under house arrest in the same building. One was a Mrs. Baxter. Well, she was a divorcee from Baltimore. And so, of course, she was not in the highest society either. But she and I got along well, and occasionally we would have fainting fits. And the officer of the guard would come to our rescue with brandy. Oh yeah, this was okay. This was not all that bad. But after a while, being in prison became kind of tiresome, and so eventually I did sign a paper that stated I would no longer, help the Confederate cause. I was then released and given $50 in gold and told to leave the area. Well, I went to Lynchburg, Virginia, and stayed with a family by the name of Nolan, and their son, William David Nolan, happened to be home on leave. He had been a Confederate artillery officer and had been wounded. Well, we met and fell in love, and that's kind of the rest of the story. And I suppose the rest of my life seems rather boring. We raised 5 children. My husband worked in the city treasurer's office. Not as exciting as my earlier years, for sure. But years later, 128 volumes were written about the Civil War. They're very well known. They're called The War of Rebellion, Official Records of the Union and Confederate Armies. My actual name appears in those official records, along with a statement that there was abundant evidence that I was a shrewd and dangerous spy. Would you believe that? I'm not sure. However, I think I will leave just in case they're still after me.
Hello. My name is Edith Lake Wilkinson. I was born in Wheeling in 1868. My father was James P. Wilkinson. He was an accountant and paymaster and veteran of the Civil War. My mother was Lucy Lake Wilkinson, and she was an artist like me and native of Edinburgh, Scotland. My sister Jane was born in 1875. In 1888, at the age of 20, I left Wheeling and I traveled to New York City, where I enrolled in the Art Student League to begin my formal training as an artist. And in 1900, I also entered the Teachers College at Columbia University, majoring in fine arts. I moved to Lower Manhattan and lived with my really good friend, Fanny Wilkinson, who was no relative. Fanny and I made several wonderful trips to Europe to see the masterworks. It was just such a great time, and we lived together for 20 years. In 1914 to 1923, I was back at the Art Students League, and I produced dozens and dozens of paintings, charcoals, and block prints, and they were exhibited in Provincetown, Massachusetts. In 1914 to 1923, I again made even more paintings, even while I was at the Art Student League, and my exhibitions were even larger. Now, a very, very serious series of family tragedies happened to our family when my sister Jane Wilkinson died just in 1907. She was married to a Vossler, and she died after giving birth to her son, Edward. His aunt, Ann Vossler, moved here from Kaiser, West Virginia, and she actually took care of Edward until he finished college. Another tragedy. In 1922, Mrs. Ann Bossler, who checked on my mother and father every day, went to their home on Zane Street in Wheeling Island. And when she looked in, she saw my mother sitting in her chair with her newspaper folded on her lap, that she had been dead for some time. My father was lying on the floor, and it looked like he had tried to get to the door. He was barely alive, and he died on the way to the hospital. Their deaths were caused by a stove with no ventilating pipe. 5 other deaths occurred in Wheeling from that same thing that winter. My parents left their entire estate to me, and it was rather large. The attorney by the name of George Rogers in March of 1924, well, actually, I'll back up. A very prominent attorney, and that was the George Jackson Rogers, took control of my estate, and he gave me a modest income, which was fine, but what I didn't realize was he was embezzling, and he took almost all of my money. This same attorney, George Rogers, in March of 1924, admitted me to the Shepherd Pratt Institution in Baltimore for the mentally ill. They said in my admission card that I was in a paranoid state, but there was never any evidence that I had any kind of a mental breakdown, ever. It is said that I was committed because I was a lesbian. Zelda Fitzgerald now was also in Shepherd Pratt. Now she was just crazy, no doubt about it. In October of 1924, I was discharged, saying that my status had improved, and I stayed out of the asylum for about 6 months. During this time, George Rogers wrote me a letter and said that I had to leave the apartment where Fanny and I were living, and that I should live on my own, but I didn't. And so I was readmitted to Shepherd Pratt in February of 1925, and I remained there for 10 years. It was a wonderful institution, one of the best and most progressive in the country. And I continued to paint, and I could walk the beautiful grounds, and it was quite lovely there. Now, George Rogers, over a period of months, cut my allowance back and wrote a letter telling me that there was nothing left to send me. This wasn't true. Rogers had taken several trips to Europe and built a very large home in Wheeling. He also wrote checks to himself from my account, one in the amount of $1,600, today would have been $20,000, and a second check for $6,500, which today would have been $96,000. In July of 1925, Mr. Rogers took all of my belongings and packed them in a trunk and shipped them to Wheeling. Fanny died in 1931 at the age of 76, but no one told me. Edward Bossler, Edith's sister's son, and only surviving relative, was eventually put in charge of my estate after George Rogers' brother-in-law filed charges against him for embezzling not only from his own family, but 9 others as well. Edward had to move me to Huntington State Hospital in 1935. This facility was horrible. It was designed to hold 500 people, and 1,500 people were housed there. There was only one psychiatrically trained physician per 150 patients. There was only one trained nurse for the entire hospital. Our food was usually served cold, and the state only allocated $1 per patient, and 37 cents of that was for food. We were only served meat about every 2 weeks, and that was usually in a stew or cream chip beef. Edward visited me on occasion and brought me a beautiful little green sweater, which I wore, but I never painted again. I lived the rest of my life in Huntington Hospital, and the last found doctor's report on me stated, Edith makes her own bed, she talks to herself, she is very talkative and imagines everything. She is good physically, but is deteriorating mentally. She is at times combative. Wouldn't you be? Edith died in 1957 at the age of 89. 60 years after Edith's death, Jeanne Hendrickson, Edith's great niece and California Emmy Award-winning writer, reintroduced a new documentary film and exhibition stated, Packed in a Trunk, The Lost Art of Edith Lake Wilkinson. It's a great documentary. A lot of that was filmed here in Wheeling. In the early 1960s, Jeanne Hendrickson's mother was visiting her sister, Betty Vossler, Edward Vossler's sister-in-law, who lived on Orchard Road in Wheeling. And she suggested that they go to the attic and get into a couple old trunks that were up there that had belonged to Edith. And lo and behold, there were a great many things that she had painted in her block prints and so forth. And Jane asked Betty if she could have some of those paintings and some of those prints that she had done. And Betty was glad to oblige. However, Betty told her she had already donated some of the paintings to either the St. Michael's or St. John's Episcopal churches from its sales in Wheeling. And because of this, Anderson believes that there are other Wilkinson paintings somewhere floating around the Wheeling area.
Good evening. It's so nice to visit with you today. My name is Henrietta Arbenz Robine False. As you can tell from my sash, I was very involved in the women's suffrage movement, in what you might call the Gilded Age. You see, until 1920, and my goodness, that was just over 100 years ago, women were not allowed to vote. I just cannot imagine that. And many women in Wheeling and around the country agreed that that was ridiculous. Well, I had been born in Wheeling, the daughter of Henry and Lily Arbenz. Father was a professor of music at the Wheeling Conservatory of Music, so I became a musician myself and served as the chairwoman of the music program for the Women's Club of Wheeling. I also worked very closely with Eleanor Caldwell in the mid-1920s when she founded the Wheeling Symphony. And later I helped popularize the summer concerts at Ogilvy Park by distributing announcements to the local merchants. But my real passion was fighting for votes for women. I married Edward Romine in 1910 when I was 20 years old. Edward was a widower and a real estate investor and an investment broker. So we were wealthy enough that I could do my own thing. It was as Mrs. Romine that I began my suffrage efforts. In 1915, I began by selling suffragist newspapers on Chapel Street in Wheeling. Then I took auto trips up the river and down the river to the steel mills, handing out flyers to the men as they finished their shifts and were heading home. I will say that the men were always very courteous to those of us who were doing this, perhaps because we were well dressed, or perhaps because we were in a car that was driven by the chauffeur for none other than George Laughlin, who was a steel man. 9 of us even made the front page of the Wheeling Intelligencer one day, sitting in Mr. Laughlin's automobile. We also brought in out-of-town speakers to support our efforts. And I can't really say that I was much of a speaker myself, but I was very good at soliciting letters and telegrams when they were needed to support our efforts. The women who were against women's suffrage set up headquarters at the corner of Market and 14th Street and put up a banner that said, "Women's place is in the home." Well, we set up an office right next door. And we put up a banner that said, "If the home is women's sphere, what are the antis doing here?" Well, finally, as you may know, the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was passed by the U.S. Congress. This was in 1919. Now, this would grant women the right to vote if 3/4 of the states also ratified that amendment. Well, in February 1920, West Virginia Governor George Cornwell called a special session of the legislature to address the 19th Amendment issue. The West Virginia House approved the resolution by a vote of 47 to 40. But then it came to the West Virginia Senate, and it was a 14-14 tie. Now what? Well, we knew that State Senator Jess Block favored the ratification of the amendment, but he was in California on vacation, probably playing golf. 3,000 miles away. But he got on a train and then another train and was scheduled to arrive in Charleston, the capital then, at 2 a.m. in the morning. Well, I offered to personally go to the train to meet him, but of course that would never do. You didn't have a young woman alone going to a train station in the middle of the night to meet a man. So I did other things. Several of the legislators were tired of hanging around and decided to go home before the vote was taken. So we ladies kept track of who these men were, the ones who were in favor, at least. One of the men was actually walking to the train himself, suitcase in hand, ready to go home, and I convinced him to come back so that the vote could be recorded in his name. And then there was another who was a carpenter. He was up on some scaffolding working on a house, and I climbed up a ladder and convinced him to get down and come to vote. Well, Senator Block made it to Wheeling, and the 19th Amendment was ratified by West Virginia. Only 2 more states were needed to make the 3/4, and that happened by August of 1920, in time for some 26 million women to vote the first time in a presidential election. I later became a charter member of the West Virginia League of Women Voters and became its second president. I was the youngest state president in the entire country. And so my work continued. After my husband, Edward Romine, passed away, I later married George Folks and lived to the ripe old age of 95. I now rest beside George in Wheeling's Greenwood Cemetery. So ladies, do not take the right to vote for granted. We worked very hard to make it possible for you to vote. Please do so.
Hello, everyone. My name is Laura Farnsworth Shank. Have any of you heard of me? Yes. Yes. I was born in Middlebourne, West Virginia in 1879. Mother had mental issues, and people said she was just not right. At 8, I was forced to work on a neighboring farm, and at 10, I came to Wheeling as a domestic servant. In that capacity, I was often sent to Shank's Meat Market for meat and was told to always ask and buy from John Shank. You see, the Shanks had the largest meatpacking plant in the United States, and they were very rich. We began dating, and after 4 years, we were secretly married in Chicago. John's family did not approve of me, and his brother Albert even tried to get John to divorce me. One of the most sensational affairs in Wheeling began in late 1910 when I was arrested for a charge of poisoning my husband. I was taken to jail, and John was admitted to Wheeling Hospital, and our 2 young children went to live at a relative's home. The case went to court in early 1911. Because of the prominence of the family, there was international coverage of the trial, and large crowds attended. One day, a mob of nearly 200 people lined up at the foot of the steps of the courthouse to get in to hear the afternoon session. The New York Times reporting was very rude, saying, for example, quote, "The published pictures flattered me," the paper stated. "She is anything but beautiful. She is more than plump. She is actually fat and with tiny blue eyes, barely perceptible eyebrows, a wonderful disarray of brown puffs hanging from the back of her head, and an old blue suit that was as shiny as her unpowdered nose. She looked more like the servant that she was formerly than the wife of a man worth $10 million. Well, Dr. Frank Lemoyne Hupp testified that my husband was ill with multiple symptoms. He said that John told the doctor he had been in Europe and had not been ill at all until he came home. Another doctor testified that bottled water, and it was called Valentine water, that John drank contained enough sugar of lead to poison a man. John's tongue was red and swollen. He had a deep black round line around his gums. He couldn't keep anything down, and his skin had a yellow tone. After John went to the hospital, doctors said that these symptoms suggested poisoning. A detective who posed as a nurse had been employed. She testified that I had asked her to poison my husband and offered to pay her $1,000. She also reported that I had told her that John treated me badly and I would never be happy until he was dead, and that I would wear a double heavy mourning veil so people would not see me laughing when he died. Then a local druggist testified that I had bought sugar of lead from him and that I had tried to buy arsenic, offering to pay him well. The trial took a dramatic turn when Daniel Phillips was called to the stand. Daniel was a handsome 28-year-old piano salesman employed by CA House Music Company in Wheeling. He said that he and I had known each other for several years and that we took many picnic rides together to lonely places. He said that I bought him presents and that I was possessed with the idea that John was going to die. Next, my chauffeur testified that when he drove Daniel and me on night rides, I would take my children along with us and we would have a picnic. And then he said that I would stay in the car with the children, sleeping under the blankets in back, and the chauffeur, well, Daniel and I would both be in the car, of course, would walk away and only return when we honked the horn. The prosecutor closed his argument stating that I was unfit to be the wife of John Shank and was unfit for association with respectable people. He said because I left my children under the rug in the car while Daniel and I were together, that I was an unfit mother. When he said that, I collapsed. My defense attorney, J.J.P. O'Brien, claimed that I was the victim of a huge conspiracy because they, the Shanks, wanted me out of their lives. And that John's illness was from other causes, that the blue line on his gums was from bad teeth and gum disease, and that no one proved that I had put any poison in his balancing water. Now, raise your hands as to, if you were the jury, would you find those that think she was guilty, raise your hands. Whoa. Those that think she was not guilty, raise your hands. My, okay. Well, here we go. The jury was deadlocked. At a count of 10-1, with only one of the men voting guilty. So I was released on my own recognizance. Very good, very good. Now here's the rest of the story. Dan Phillips left town fearing for his life and violence against him. The court issued a restraining order against Mrs. Shank, forbidding her from entering the home of John Shank or harassing, annoying, or having any communication with him. She was also forbidden to interfere in any way with her children. A few minutes before her release from jail, she was served with divorce papers. She then filed a countersuit, and she also sued her defense attorneys, demanding an accounting of securities and personal property, which she alleged were placed in their hands. That suit was thrown out of court. Although Shank said that he would not be responsible for the deaths of his wife, it was held that he had to pay the costs of the trial, some estimates totaling over $100,000. And papers were also filed in circuit court in the case of Stutes and Nickel versus John Shank for meals furnished to Mrs. Laura Shank when she was in the county jail awaiting trial. Mrs. Shank had apparently been furnished with the best meals possible from the Antler Cafe, and the bill was $142.40. Today it would have been $460. John Shank was granted a divorce and from Laura in 1913. He reportedly agreed to pay alimony of $100 per month, which would be now, I think it was $1,400 a month that he had to pay for the rest of her life. 4 years after the trial, Shank married schoolteacher Grace Fent and left for an extended European honeymoon. The marriage was performed secretly to avoid possible interference by Laura. John Shank died of a coronary embolism on November the 22nd, 1942, at the age of 80. At the time of his death, he and his wife were living in his beloved uplands, now called Altenheim. He was buried in Greenwood Cemetery. Laura Shank never remarried. She was living at 122 Center Street in Elm Grove when she died on January 31st, 1950, at the age of 70. She was buried in Greenwood Cemetery. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Gladys Elias. I'm sure you're familiar with the name Bill Elias. I was his wife. I don't really consider myself very notable, but you might be interested in my untimely death. It was at the hands of a woman by the name of Elsie Russell. Now, Elsie was married to Mike Russell, who was a cousin of my husband, Bill. Mike had been in charge of Bill's various business dealings when Bill was in prison. And Bill suspected that Mike might have been a bit less than honest with the business finances. Now, Elsie and I had been friends for years, and I think she was jealous of me and the possessions that I had. She had actually started spreading malicious gossip about me, and so, I just couldn't put up with that. Well, I wasn't really known for keeping my temper. You see, one time I threw a beer bottle at her because she wouldn't give me another beer, and another time she said she didn't have cigarettes. I didn't believe her, so I threw an ashtray at her, and I broke a few pieces of her furniture, but, well, anyway. I swore that if she continued to gossip about me, I would knock the hell out of her. So now we come to Thursday, April 27th, 1934. I was on the phone with Elsie earlier in the day. She told me that another one of Bill's cousins, Theodore Russell, was going around town saying that if Bill went back to prison, that he would take our house and my jewelry. Well, this really made me mad. So I decided to confront Elsie about this. So I went to her apartment and sent her wheeling. I knew she kept a gun in the nightstand, so I went in there and got the gun. Well, after a few minutes, we started actually fighting. Knocked down, drag out. I hit her in the face, I busted her lip. We both ended up with several bruises. I had a cut forehead and a broken nose, and then the gun fired over and over. I was hit in one knee and in the shoulder, two in the chest. One went to my lungs, and the fatal shot went to my heart. Would you believe that the newspaper the next morning said I died of suicide? Yeah, right. You know, I'm going to break my nose, I'm going to shoot myself, and that didn't work, so I'm going to shoot myself again, and that didn't work, so I'm going to shoot. Yeah, ridiculous. Well, I was dead, though. They say that 2,800 people attended my funeral. It was, at that time, the largest funeral that the city had ever seen. There were so many flower arrangements that the Wheeling florist had to send to Pittsburgh for more flowers. They say that the most beautiful floral arrangement was a tribute that was a stand of flowers about 5 feet tall with a white dove on top, sent by Mike Russell, Elsie's husband. Well, after the funeral service itself, about 200 cars followed the hearse to Greenwood Cemetery, where I was interred. I reposed there for about 3 decades, until in 1964 my remains were exhumed and reburied in Iowa, where I had been born. So what happened after my death? Well, Elsie was charged with my murder. But the judge told the jury not to entertain a verdict of first-degree murder because there was no evidence that the act was premeditated. So that left 4 options. Second-degree murder would have had a penalty of about 5 years in prison. Voluntary manslaughter, 1 to 5 years. Involuntary manslaughter, 1 year or less, or not guilty. So what do you think happened?
Not guilty.
Not guilty. When the jury came back with that verdict, the room exploded in cheers and jeers, and the judge had to pound his gavel in order to keep order. So now the rest of the story. About 8 months after my death, Bill remarried a lovely lady, Elpida Contromanis, who went by the name of Alice Manos. She was of Greek parentage, but had been born in Brooklyn. Bill and Mike continued to have their difficulties, though. And about 3 years later, Mike was actually scheduled to testify in federal court against Bill. Before the trial, though, a few days before, on August 30th of 1937, Mike left the business meeting and went to his apartment on 15th Street. Elsie was there at home. She was looking out the second-story window of their apartment, and she saw a stalky man who stood over her husband and shot him again and again. Her screams awakened the neighbors. About 20 calls were placed to the local police department, which was very close at the time. The police arrived almost immediately, but Mike was gone. He was shot in the head. There were 10 shell casings that were found from a .38. 2 shots to the head that killed him almost immediately. And then the gunman fired about 8 more shots into his body to the point that one of his arms was almost detached. No one was ever charged with his murder. Well, after witnessing this murder, Elsie had second thoughts about staying in Wheeling, and she left. Oh, I'm not sure just where she went, but she disappeared from the records. I think that was probably a good idea. So that's my story. It's not a very pretty one, but I thought you might be interested in it this evening. And we hope that Judi and I have given you a picture of some of Wheeling's notable women. This is, after all, Women's History Month, I believe. So thanks for your attention this evening.
Thank you. You were close.
Certainly, yeah.
Yes.
Oh, there's a drawing.
Well, there.
You might win a
Have
prize.
a good evening. Good to see you.
Here they come.
Everybody got their tickets out? Here come the fish bowls. So how about if we have one of these ladies draw from one fish bowl and then we'll have.
You think it's fixed?
Huh?
For the door prize.
This is for the door prize, the white tickets.
The last 3 digits are 436.
That's the wrong.
0436, there we go, right back here.
It ends with 3167.
3167.
3167, here we go, right here. Okay, this is our next, first of all, thank you very much for coming back. Very much. We appreciate you coming back and doing this. Some of this was familiar. We did a trial, I think, on which one of the ladies? Yeah. What was the name of the lady? The one, Shank. On Shank, yes. Okay, so next week is going to be our last lecture presentation. And Taylor Abbott is going to be here how many people saw the Scioto? Okay, well that was last year's. This year he's going to talk about exploration down the Ohio River, you know. Anybody know who the first person was that probably recorded a trip down the Ohio River? Who? Celeron, yeah, Celeron de Bienville, French. And that was to claim all of the territory that was drained by the tributaries of the Ohio for France. And there was a war. We had a lecture previously in this season telling about the Battle of Monongahela, which was one of the major battles of that war. And we all know that because the English won that war, we speak English today and not French. Thank God. And so anyway, we hope to see you all back again next week with Taylor Abbott. That'll be the concluding presentation for this lecture series. And thank you all for coming and participating.
Thank you.